Hi everyone, my name is Andres Gannon. Along with Chelsea Estancona, I help run the online Peace Science Society Colloquium. This was a program that was started in 2015 as part of the Peace Science Society's annual meeting, and the goal of it is to celebrate the excellent research that happens both before and after the Peace Science Society meeting, and to share it with the wider community online. Today, we have a paper entitled Practice Makes Perfect, Ambassador Experience in Joint Military Exercises by Erik of Texas A&M University. And our two discussants for today are Calvin Thrall, an assistant professor at Columbia, and David Lindsey, an associate professor at CUNY Baruch. The structure for the way we'll do participation today is that attendees are invited to leave comments or questions in the chat, and we'll sort of lead that with the natural flow of the conversation afterwards. Erik will give a short presentation first, followed by comments from Calvin and David. I will sort of prioritize the discussant comments from Calvin and David, but everything that's in the chat will be saved and given to Erik later on. So let's go ahead and Erik, have you present your work, and then we'll have feedback from Calvin, followed by David.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Erik. I'm a third-year student at Texas A&M, and I'll be presenting my paper titled Practice Makes Perfect, Ambassador Experience and Joint Military Exercises. The kind of big picture research question is, trying to answer what is the influence of an individual in foreign policy. Previous scholars have looked at this from the perspective of leaders, elites, and policy entrepreneurs in a variety of domains and policy areas. More recently, some people have been starting to focus on the foreign policy bureaucrats and their role in the making of foreign policy. This paper is going to ask, what influence do career histories have on those diplomatic outputs? Empirically, I'll be focusing on the U.S. ambassadors and joint military exercises with the United States. Okay, and to just jump straight into it, who are ambassadors? Well, ambassadors are these capable, autonomous, and highly, self-motivated bureaucrats. They're the personal representative of the president to these host countries, and they more or less run the, bilateral relations between the United States and their host countries. What do they want? Well, they generally seek to advance bilateral relations. There's both intrinsic through selection and socialization into the foreign service, as well as career-based incentives for producing positive diplomatic relations between the United States and their host countries. But how do they go about doing these, advancing these diplomatic relations? Well, it's through the production of diplomatic outputs. So this can be signing agreements and other things like that, but I'll be focusing on the conduct of joint military exercises. Okay, so then what is the influence of career history? Well, foreign service officers are subjected to various socialization pressures throughout their careers. They develop these affinities toward foreign perspectives and the affinities towards, advancing the bilateral relations between the United States and their host countries. But moreover, bureaucrats, they learn on the job. They learn what's important and how to achieve those things. And more to the point of the paper and the theoretical argument that I'm making, it's that, subject-specific working experience lowers the cost of future engagements. Ambassadors, they're very busy people. They have limited time and attention. And so in order to pursue their goals of advancing bilateral relations, they're going to have to pick and choose the types of diplomatic outputs that they pursue. And so I believe that they're going to pursue the things that they are, efficient at producing. And my argument is that the career histories and working experience is going to give them that efficiency edge. Okay, but what's the role of ambassadors in joint military exercises? And to get into this, I'll be talking about the U.S. military exercises with Poland in 2016. And the context is that there was this NATO summit that was going to be held in Warsaw in 2016. But leading up to it, the leadership in DC were pretty hesitant about holding a joint military exercise with Poland because they didn't want to seem overly provocative to the Russians. They didn't want the Polish to kind of like hijack the messaging around the joint military exercise and kind of blow it out of proportion. But enter the U.S. ambassador to Poland at the time, Ambassador Paul Jones, and he saw the value of these joint military exercises, and so he pushed back in Washington and said, we really got to do this and we can handle it. And by handle it, he means handle the PR perspective and the provocation against Russia kind of stuff, to not blow that out of proportion. And so the his military counterpart, General Ben Hodges, he's the commanding general of U.S. Army Europe at the time. He expresses similar sentiment about the political pressures from D.C. He says there was a lot of heat coming from D.C. They did not want this exercise to happen. But together, ultimately, Ambassador Paul Jones was able to get this kind of military exercise greenlit by the political leadership in DC. And what ended up happening was one of the largest joint military exercises in Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War, with over 30,000 troops participating. But why was Ambassador Jones so effective? And it really stems from his career experiences. He says, I was real comfortable and real familiar working closely with our militaries since my first plunge in Bosnia, which was a tricky one, and then in Macedonia, Philippines, Afghanistan, and the Naval War College. So ambassadors have these motivations for improving bilateral relations, but they are also limited in time and attention. So they should gravitate towards the policies that they can implement most efficiently. And so hypothesis one states that ambassadors with greater prior joint military exercise experience are going to engage their current host countries with more JMEs than the less experienced ambassadors. But moreover, alliances feature JMEs as an institutional feature. And there's also some public opinion incentives as well, that being that JMEs only provide boost to public opinion, local public opinion among allied participants. And so hypothesis two states that the effect of an ambassador's prior JME experience on the current conduct of JMEs with the current host is going to be larger among the allied host countries. So there are two main data sources that I'm going to be using in this paper. The first one for the joint military exercises comes from Jordan Bernhardt. He has this data set covering 1977 to 2016. And it has a comprehensive list of just multilateral joint military exercises. I am also going to be using the key officers of the U.S. Foreign Service data set from Lindsey and co-authors and Matt Malice. This covers the 1966 to 2018. So I'm just going to present to you this quick little table covering, describing the mean and standard deviation of the number of joint military exercises and the number of ambassadors' prior joint military exercises over the sample of analysis, which is going to be between the country quarter years between 1985 and 2016, where there's a career ambassador present. And so the kind of dependent variable is relatively self-explanatory. It's just the number of JMEs. But then the independent variable that I'm interested in is a little bit more convoluted. So I construct this measure of prior experience with JMEs, considering only the joint military exercises that the ambassador experienced in prior diplomatic assignments as either ambassador, as deputy chief of mission, a political officer, or as a defense attaché. And so I have this table here to kind of demonstrate what that looks like. So this is the career timeline of Ambassador Beecroft as he appears in the key officers data set. So he first appears 1995, 1996 as DCM in Jordan. So he has one JME experience there. He later becomes an ambassador to Jordan between 2008 and 2011. And the prior JME experience variable would be equal to 1 at that point. During this 3-year tenure, he accumulates another 6 JMEs. His next assignment is DCM to Iraq. I have a dash there because he's not the ambassador, right? So he doesn't enter into the data set effectively for the analysis. But then he later becomes ambassador to Iraq between 2012 and 2014. And so his cumulative experience at that point is this, the 7 JMEs. And then he has one final ambassador assignment in the data set to Egypt, where he has a total of 10 prior JMEs experienced. Okay, so here I just have the kind of marginal density plots for the outcome, so the dependent variable on the left here, and then the independent variable, so the number of prior joint military exercises experienced by the ambassador on the right. These are both log transformed data, so still fairly skewed, which is unfortunate, but we have the deal with the data we have, not the data we want. But to test the hypotheses, I'm going to estimate these two equations via OLS. And so this is just a regression of the ambassador's prior JME experience on the current JMEs with the current host country. And then in hypothesis 2, it's the same thing, except I've just included this interaction term between the ambassador's experience and whether or not the current host country is a US ally. So causal identification here relies on the conditional independence assumption of the ambassador's prior JME experience, right? So that's to say that there shouldn't be appointment or selection on the basis of prior experience, conditional instead of covariates, right? And so to that end, I'll be controlling for this kind of battery of covariates here. A lot of these are going to be political, some of these economic, and some of these will vary or some of these are like ambassadorial specific, the post-specific variables. And then I also include time in the key officers data as well. Okay, so H1, hypothesis 1, basically states that more experienced ambassadors are going to have more joint military exercises with their current hosts. And so here I'm going to present to you the regression results using the log transformed dependent variable and independent variables. I have two models here. One of them includes only the quarter year, so the time fixed effects, and the other one does the two-way fixed effects by country and quarter year. I have covariates included in both these models, and standard errors are clustered two ways by ambassador and quarter year. So here we have positive coefficients for the ambassador's prior experience, but including the country fixed effects, I lose statistical significance. So kind of, not so great for this hypothesis. But in hypothesis 2, right, it's more or less the same prediction, except that this effect is going to be larger among allied hosts. And so I test that with this interaction term between the experience and the ally variable. And what we find is a positive and statistically significant interaction term. Again, these are country quarter year observations, covariates are included, and then I deal with the standard errors in the same way as before. But beyond just having that positive and significant interaction term, we're interested in the marginal effect of ambassador's prior experience. So I'm going to take the two-way fixed effects model, and I'm going to just plot the marginal effects for that. And here we find that, yes, indeed, there is a positive and statistically significant marginal effect for the ambassador's prior JME experience on JMEs of the current host country. Okay, so here I present kind of like a mechanism test, right? So there's positive returns to host country public opinion through JMEs, but it operates through like local news media coverage. And to the extent that combat exercises are more visible and more likely to be covered than non-combat exercises, I'm arguing basically that ambassadors should try to pursue these types of exercises, the combat exercises, more than the less salient non-combat exercises. Right, so if ambassadors want to produce these JMEs to advance bilateral relations or out of these career aspirations, then they should choose to produce the more salient combat JMEs rather than the less salient non-combat JMEs. And so here I present results. The regression specification is very similar, except now I'm breaking up the dependent and independent variables into combat JMEs and then experience with combat or non-combat JMEs. And so from this table, it's a lot, but basically what we can learn from this is that experience across either combat and non-combat joint military exercises matters for their current implementation, but only when that outcome is the combat JMEs. So experience matters across both of them, but when given the choice, right, ambassadors are going to pursue these combat JMEs over the non-combat JMEs. Okay, so the results here, right, hinge on this identification assumption, right, conditional independence of ambassador experience. And to that end, I have some balance tests and sensitivity analyses in the paper, which I'll gloss over for now for the sake of time. But just to wrap things up, joint military exercises are typically seen as the product of top-down strategic considerations. And in this paper, I argue and demonstrate that ambassador career experience is a meaningful determinant in their conduct. And in particular, the ambassador experience is going to be most impactful among allied hosts, where the existing infrastructure and the returns to local public opinion provide incentives for their implementation. So thanks you all for being here, and thanks for listening to my presentation. And that's all I have for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Erik. We'll turn it over to our two discussants now, starting with Calvin.
Awesome. So, Andres, how much time should I spend talking here? Like,
Let's say like 10-ish minutes.
okay, perfect, perfect. So yeah, thanks all for the invitation. Like, I think this is a super creative paper. I'm biased, obviously, but I think it's great to use the key officers data to study the effects of career histories on ambassadorial behavior. Now that we have this data on like, sub-ambassadorial career histories. So that's really cool. And I think like looking at embassy military dynamics is something that we really haven't done enough of, especially given like how much, if you listen to like, for example, what former ambassadors say about their experiences, especially recently, it's all like, oh, there's all this sort of like interagency collaboration, but also clashing with DoD and like, you know. So I think these are important dynamics to try to understand. Um, so I think like I have a bunch of comments here, but I think my main comment here, right, is that the theory, right? So you have this example of the U.S. Poland JME in 2016, but the theory is pretty vague otherwise on like the actual mechanisms through which ambassadors are going to matter for whether JMEs happen or not, right? Like, so Kevin is on the call. He's the person to ask. I do not know that much about JMEs except for what I've learned from Kevin at the bar. But I assume, right, that military or DoD officials, right, not diplomats, are actually responsible for like initiating the planning and design process of JMEs. I could be wrong, but that's my assumption. Um, and so something that seems important for this paper is more actual process background on like the data generating process for when the US has a joint military exercise or not, right? So for example, one of the things that I've learned from Kevin at the bar is that some joint military exercises are like annually or semi-annually reoccurring, right? They take place on a set schedule, right? And it's not really like, you know, it's not really that like someone calls them on an ad hoc basis. It's just like, okay, we're having one each year, right? You mentioned Conquest in Mongolia, which is one of these annual ones. So in the example you provide of the Anaconda 2016 JME, it sounds like the what happened was one, the joint military exercise is planned by somebody else, military commanders, etc. Two, there's some sort of diplomatic crisis that happens. Three, the ambassador's role is to talk the White House off the ledge in terms of calling it off in response to the crisis, right? So like if you think that this is what happens, right, and it's like ambassadors sort of, maybe they're not planning these things, but they are keeping them on the tracks, then I wonder if you can look at like an outcome that's maybe like the proportion of planned JMEs that actually happen, right? Or like focusing on the disparity between like, what's supposed to happen and what does happen, as opposed to just like a count of JMEs, which could have been planned in advance. Another possibility, right, that you mentioned, right, is that JMEs are just kind of like diplomatically tricky, right? They can be good exercises in bilateral public diplomacy, but they can also inflame tensions with rivals, right? So you have to handle them very carefully, right? And so maybe if we go further back down the DGP, maybe the White House only feels comfortable okaying a military exercise if they think the ambassador is going to do a good job with the spin. And so like, you cite Galambos 2023. I wonder if you can actually get at some sort of public diplomacy related outcome, right? And show us that maybe JMEs have stronger positive effects on public opinion in the presence of more experienced ambassadors, right? Or that you get more positive media coverage or less negative media coverage when you have an ambassador who's actually handing the spin. I think this would be a very cool sort of outcome to do. A third possibility, right, is that embassies can sort of serve as brokers, right, between the various groups necessary to facilitate a JME, right? So you have the US military and defense agencies, the host state military and defense agencies, the host state government, and so on. And then, if that's the case, then ambassadors with more JME experience know more about how to do this kind of brokering because they've done it before, seen it done, and they can make sure it goes smoothly. So on this, right, is there any standardized measure of how well a JME went, right? Like success or performance, right, that you could use here to sort of say like, well, maybe actually ambassador experience matters for like, the actual sort of coordination and implementation of the JME. And if the mechanism is about just sort of the ability to broker these groups, right? Are there other forms of experience that an ambassador could have that could sort of do the same thing, right? Like, what about personal military service or service in host states with large U.S. military bases or something like this, right? Does it have to be JME experience or is it just military familiarity? Okay, so that's the first big comment. Two, right? So the issue of selection, right? And the particular selection problem I'm thinking about, right, is like, you know, somebody at the White House or in the sort of uh, the State Department, right, like knows that we're doing this military stuff in a particular state. They want to make sure we have an ambassador in place who, is competent and is going to do a good job. And so it's not a causal thing. It's just like, it's what it is a top-down story after all. And the balance tests you do are good, but like, so one thing that occurred to me, right, is like you have this nice heterogeneity in the sense that like some jammies are annually recurring or just like regularly reoccurring, whereas some are ad hoc, right? And the ones that are scheduled in advance to annually reoccur, they're pretty easy to sort of like foresee from the White House or the State Department's perspective, right? You know they're going to happen. So since you know that they're going to happen, you can make sure someone's in place. But if there are, for example, ad hoc exercises that maybe, come about in response to some sort of unexpected threat or something like that, then it would be harder to make the case that like, the ambassador was selected because they wanted to make sure somebody was in place who could handle this. So I wonder if you could limit to these sort of ad hoc, non-reoccurring jammies and see if you still get the same effect. I think that would be convincing to me on the issue of selection. Third, I would like you to tell us more about the geographic distribution of jammies. So we know, right, that some Foreign Service officers are regional experts and primarily get posted to one certain part of the world. So you use the example of Beecroft, right? And all of his sort of top appointments are in like Middle East, North Africa, right? So simply being like a Middle East, North Africa specialist, for example, could confound the relationship between past JMEs and future JMEs, right? If you just get posted to a part of the world where we do a lot of JMEs because you're an expert, that it might even be true, right, that regional expertise is important, but it might be that it's regional expertise and not JME experience in particular. So yeah, I don't really know. I mean, you could create a sort of regional expertise variable. Me and Matt do that in our diplomatic capacity paper, and try controlling for that instead of just overall experience. Could be something to do. Fourth, right? So like, it does strike me that if you want to establish the relevance of ambassadors for jammies, a very nice, off the shelf sort of design you could do is to take the Malice 2021 style vacancy design and show us that ambassadorial vacancies decrease, JME occurrence, right? Like that, I think that would at the very least, it might not tell us that ambassadors are the reason they happen, but it would tell us a lot about, right? Like the the fact that somebody at some level of the process thinks that it's important to have an ambassador in place for these to happen. So that could be sort of like almost a preliminary analysis, right? Where you like say, hey, clearly this official is relevant for this process. Okay, two more quick points. First, right, I think that you can potentially build a stronger theoretical foundation for the ally versus non-ally result. At present, it kind of reads like, you know, it kind of reads like I'm not entirely sure why the marginal effect of any of these things would be only existent among allies, right? Like maybe the level would be lower among non-allies, but I can't understand why the marginal effect would be smaller. So like one possibility for this is that, it's about the balance of power between the embassy and the military in different countries, right? Like maybe in non-allied states, like there's more military basing or the military otherwise like has a larger presence. You could think about Iraq, for example, versus Canada, which has like, very few active military posted to it. I think I'm the worst person on the call to make that kind of claim, but based on the quick Googling I did before this call, that's what I think. So yeah, or is it because we simply do different types of joint military exercises with non-allies versus allies? Like I think if this is going to be a crucial, sort of conditional result, then I want more theory about why we see it. Um, and yeah, I mean the last thing, right, is like, so I think that the current mechanism test in the paper, which is combat versus non-combat, again, it's interesting, but I don't think it quite gets to the question of how exactly ambassadors are involved in the process, right? Like you write in this section, ambassadors should also pursue the types of exercises that serve this goal of increasing public opinion the most, right? But then do we believe that ambassadors are actually instigating and determining what type of jammy happens, right? Like, you know, or is it that they're like maybe selectively exercising effort to try to make sure that certain types do happen versus don't, right? And so I think just, maybe that I'll conclude here, but I think the broad thing that you want to do in this paper is just establish the relevance of ambassadors for military exercises, right? Because I think a lot of readers will probably say like, no, that's a military thing, that the ambassador isn't as important. And what you really want to do is like, I mean, the example of Anaconda is great, but I think you want to give us a little bit more meat on like this is an actor we should be thinking about when we're trying to explain jammies. But yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Calvin. We'll turn it over to David.
Awesome. Yeah, let me just start by seconding everything Calvin said. And I do think the most important thing to do here is to give us more on the process, sort of, walk us through the typical military exercise, like what happens and what was the role the ambassador played there. Also, in terms of theory, sort of picking up on what Calvin said, this is like a strategic interaction that appears to have at least three players that are important in it, right? There's the ambassador, there's the foreign government, and then there's the non-ambassador U.S. government, which in some of your examples seems to be even further disaggregated into various actors. But I think you want to think about a theory that explains at least those three actors and sort of what their interests are in this process. And then you might also think about when those interests vary. And so rather than sort of looking for these big picture average effects, right, you might actually do a lot more analysis that's focused on certain subsets, right? Like at the moment, there's no one in the world that wants the United States and Russia to do a joint military exercise. They don't want it. We don't want it. Our embassy doesn't want it, right? And so that's just going to be a different thing than sort of what some of the other scenarios you're talking about. And you can kind of think in terms of the role the ambassador is playing. The main story you seem to tell right now is this efficiency story where it's like the ambassador knows how to check the particular boxes that need to be checked to do one of these things. And so then we would expect them to matter in a context where the US wants it, the foreign country wants it, and there's a need for someone to make it happen. But another story that seems to be sort of floating in there as well is that maybe the ambassador works in a context where the foreign country wants it. The US government is lukewarm, unsure, mildly opposed, or something like that. And the ambassador is sort of advancing that foreign country interest in the exercise, convincing the US government to do it. Or you could also, you don't really talk about this, but you could imagine the reverse, right? Like the US military really wants to go and do an exercise in Greenland or something. The Danes are skeptical, and the ambassador needs to convince them. And so you can kind of make a 3x3 table with all of those cells. And I think you might want to think about ways of measuring which one of those we're in, which also might be really where this ally variable starts to play more of a theoretical role. Similarly, when we sort of think about the motives for exercises, right, like the mechanism you talk about right now operates mostly in public opinion. It's pretty hard for me to believe that that's the main motive involved in exercises, as opposed to signaling value to potential adversaries or capability development for the foreign military or things like that. So I would consider sort of addressing more of the spectrum there, so that you can really sort of look at what's going on. Then sort of turning to the ambassadors and thinking about why ambassadorial experience matters. Again, there's a couple of ideas floating around, and I think you want to sort of pull them out and clarify them. So one is just that like they know how to check the boxes once they've done this before. Another possible one, though, is like you've done joint military exercises before, you recognize their value, and now you're going to promote them in your next assignment, because that's sort of a tool that is now in your toolbox as something that seems important and valuable. And then a third one might be sort of just a more general. You can imagine that diplomats have sort of different levels of comfort with military options, just sort of generically speaking. And so maybe having had that just sort of makes you more comfortable working with the military in a big picture sense. In which case, probably it's not really about joint military exercises in the past. It's about something a little different than that, but it might be proxying for it. So with all that said, I'm now just kind of going to go into empirics since Calvin did a lot of theory. So just a few things here. The way you construct the experience measure raised a lot of concerns, right? So you do this as just experience with military exercises as ambassador, DCM, political officer, or you say defense attaché. But if you're doing FSOs, that shouldn't ever actually happen, except via measurement error. So that's odd, right? Why exactly are you cutting it off in that way, right? In particular, the inclusion of political officers but not other section chiefs is strange. I can understand what a justification might be here in terms of that person having played a different role. But it seems ad hoc, and it's going to result in a bias where political officers sort of mechanically score higher on this than people with other backgrounds. So I think one reasonable cutoff would be to just do ambassadors and DCMs and sort of say this is about having like executive level experience with these. But I think if you're not going to do that, I would encourage you to, at least as a robustness check, do sort of any experience at all, or at least any experience at the section chief level. Similarly, the way that you construct the measure, it's going to mechanically increase over time for everyone. And I understand you have these like experience fixed effects, but I'm not sure that's doing quite what you want it to in terms of this. And you might also think on a theoretical level, right? If you did a military exercise 9 years ago, does that really matter? Right. And so one way to think about this is maybe it's like, how many have you done in the last 5 years or something like that would make a little more sense. You also want to do more to control for sort of what the mill-mill relationship with the United States is. And I think there are a variety of variables that you can use to do that. So one obvious thing I think you ought to control for at the embassy level is there a defense attaché present at this embassy? The answer is almost always yes. And so one idea that you might go a little further than that is to look at the rank of that defense attaché, right, as sort of an indicator of the significance of that. That is not directly in our data, but you could very easily pull that out of our data. You also should probably look at things like defense cooperation agreements, arms sales, right? Just other forms of defense cooperation with the United States that are potentially going to be relevant to all this. And in particular, exercises are often associated with arms sales. So that's, I think, a variable you definitely need. You might also want to look at other embassy characteristics, right? Like embassy size, things like this, right? It could just sort of turn out we send these experienced ambassadors to big embassies that just generally have sort of the capacity to set up here. And then I think you want to look at more ambassadorial characteristics, right? Because right now you're only doing, do you have joint military exercise experience? And there is like a theoretical question here about exactly what you want there. But I can imagine a variety of other things that might be confounds or that might sort of be parallel mechanisms. So on sort of the confound side, like you, at least if you're doing this political officer thing, you need to control for this person's foreign service cone, right? To deal with that. You might also want to control for things like, is this your first time as an ambassador? Right? Because maybe just like first time ambassadors mechanically score lower on your experience measure and also just do less because they're just less experienced generally. And whether that's like a parallel mechanism or an opposing mechanism, I'm not quite sure, but it's worth looking at. And along the same lines, you might want to do like, have you ever been a DCM? Then some other nice to have ambassadorial variables that you can get, but through a different channel, is your experience with the military generally, right? So have you served in the military? Have you been in FSO assignments? Like, were you assigned to the Pentagon, right? Have you worked for a combatant command or something like that, right? These are, did you teach at or attend a military staff college? The place you can get these if you want to do it is from the Ryan Scoville Certificates of Competency for Chief Submission, which have a pretty comprehensive capsule one-page biography for every ambassador. So you can pretty easily, I think, go through that and code these variables. And then I think this can start helping you think about an exact mechanism, right? Is it really the experience with these exercises that matters, or is it that kind of general military experience that matters, which might also go to mechanism, right? Because if it is like understanding the boxes to check to do an exercise, then it should be exercise experience that matters. But if it's one of these other things, like sort of seeing the value in this, being comfortable with the military, things like that, then that other stuff should matter a great deal as well. I'm also not sure why you're excluding political ambassadors, right? They do vary on the IV, at least if they have a second tour. They seem to fit within the scope of the theory. So at least if you control for political status as an additional control, it seems to me that they matter there. And then finally, you're kind of trying to take just a classic correlational regression and then polish it up as a causal thing based on a conditional independence assumption, which, I mean, you could frame any regression anyone's ever run that way. And I thought that was sort of silly. And I would just sort of acknowledge you're doing a correlational regression and run with it and sort of do the standard thing, which is say I've controlled for all the things I can control for, and this seems pretty plausible. But like you don't actually have a causal design here. And on the selection side, I mean, it is just obviously the case that Foreign Service officers are selected based on their experience and qualifications for positions where that is expected to be useful, right? Like that is the purpose of the system is to accomplish that goal. And so while I think it's fair to say like it's not like, well, you select exactly on JME experience because you're planning future JMEs. It is certainly the case that like that general sort of pattern is happening, where if you have a very important military relationship, you're looking for someone that has some experience with that. And so, I don't think that like causes a real problem for the paper, but I just wouldn't present it this way as sort of something more than it is, perhaps. But overall, like I think this is great. I think this is really interesting, and I thought it was a fantastic project.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate the interesting insights from both you and Calvin. Erik, we'll turn it over to you now for about 5-ish minutes to give sort of feedback, thoughts, reflections, insights on what Calvin and David have presented or told you about. While that's occurring, if anyone in the audience wants to raise their hand to get into the queue to give additional feedback, or you can pop a comment into the chat for the Q&A. After Erik finishes sort of debriefing, we can turn it over for more general comments.
No, this is really fantastic. Thank you all so much for your feedback. I guess it's a lot to take in, so I'm still struggling to process things. But I guess this kind of project started with the idea that people, ambassadors with prior military experience would be the ones to pursue these types of diplomatic outcomes the most. And so I've looked at the Scoville data before, and it turns out there's actually like vanishingly few prior military ambassadors, and so that kind of idea was ditched fairly early on. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. This has been very insightful. I think the theory has been the most difficult part, and trying to figure out exactly what the role of the ambassador is the kind of crucial but missing part so far. I guess I had envisioned it more of as like the ambassador serves as this kind of political lubricant for these joint military exercises to occur. And so that kind of gets at a little bit of what you've been discussing here. But yeah, I think a lot of work needed to just kind of make the argument sharper and to narrow in on exactly what's happening behind the scenes. So really appreciate your comments and your time.
I wanted to jump in sort of two thoughts I had based on the feedback that folks gave. I think this is really great. I like that you're sort of at the intersection of military issues and personnel and actors and civilian ones, and that I think is a way to pitch this story. My understanding is I think a way that you could frame what happens now is we tend to think about three actors here, that there's the US military, the foreign military, and the host government. And you're sort of making a point that seems obvious, but seems understated, which there's a fourth actor, which is the US civilian government. And that sort of completes the quad that exists here. And what you're doing is pointing out that US politicians and non-military actors play a role in how these military exercises happen. And the mechanism by which they do that is diplomats, the sort of political lubricant story that you gave. And so I think thinking about what you're doing is introducing another actor that we know plays a role. We just don't really have a good sense of how, as a way of thinking about ambassadors as being the sort of mechanism for those four actors, two on each side, as opposed to, thinking about the ambassador as an actor themselves, which they are. But, I think that sort of helps with some of the mechanism stuff. The second thing that I think could help with the big picture framing is starting off with just one, what's the purpose of joint military exercises, which I think David mentioned, and it's a really important point. There are several. They, serve to reassure the government of the host country. They can serve to, they're a signal to potential adversaries. They're a way to increase military efficiency or efficacy in actual joint combat operations. They're a way to get training experience for it. You can sort of list out what all of these purposes are and sort of have that outlined. Then do the same thing for ambassadors. Like, what is the purpose of a US ambassador? And you'll have a list of what those things are as well from what we know in the literature. And where you get the Venn diagram of, hey, here's a purpose or an IR goal that is both the purpose of joint military exercises and also something that diplomats do. Now I think that can be a starting point for thinking through what the mechanisms are for, like, hey, look, the goal of a diplomat is to improve relations with a host government. The point of joint military exercises is to improve relations with host governments. Here's a way in which that intersection can tease out some sort of finer grained mechanisms by which the diplomat can play a role in how those things occur. So I think if you sort of just start with the goal of both of those things, that can be a way to get some framing for the theory that could, get you to tease out some of the stuff there a little bit more.
Can I just jump in? Cool. So yeah, great presentation, Eric. First, I think it's weird that you're doing exactly the intersection of what I do and what Calvin does. I know that the two of us are sometimes confused as tall people who went to UT, but this really cements it. So I would also say, please send me your paper if you feel like it. I'm more than happy to read it and give feedback on it. I should have volunteered as a discussant, given my knowledge of military exercises. Anyways, so just a couple of quick comments. I did really like the opening example of US Poland and Poland being hesitant because like we see today like a lot of huge military exercises going on in Europe and Poland being one of the heavier spenders in NATO. And so this is an unexpected event of Poland being hesitant to hold a military exercise, whereas generally they host them on a regular basis. So I thought that was good framing. I agree with all of the comments that Calvin and David made about theoretical and empirical issues. And I really liked Andreas's framing of the Venn diagram of the overlap between these two topics and how that can frame your contribution more generally. And I think my biggest takeaway is that I would really like to see more of the theory again. And how exactly do ambassadors contribute to the process of producing military exercises? Because this is the thing in the literature, in the JME literature, that we don't really know much about, right? So we know that you have to have a status of force agreement, a visiting force agreement, you have to have a cooperation agreement, you have to have some kind of institution that will provide for like a legal basis for troops to be in another country. But we don't know a whole lot about how those are produced or where they come from. But that leads to yet another potential confounder, which is that these agreements take months and months and months to agree on, right? They don't just come out of thin air. So if your argument is that when an ambassador with experience comes into office and then that year or even the next year we should expect more, I would be hesitant because I think it's going to take more time for an ambassador, even if this is the causal mechanism is the ambassador, him or herself. It's going to take more than just 1 year to actually produce an effect. Some of the other things to watch out for, is that, yeah, like Calvin mentioned, these exercises are often regularized. So if you are an ambassador in Australia, in Thailand, in Turkey, in Spain, yada, 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 you are going to have military exercises with the United States. So it doesn't matter who you are, what your experience is. And so I think his Calvin's suggestion of using the vacancy would be a good way to look at this. So what is the counterfactual? What if the ambassador disappears? Right. So the theory would suggest that there would be fewer military exercises, right? Or that some qualitative difference in the amount of military cooperation. So what happens if there are vacancies? I would also caution you with your unit of analysis, country quarter years. So December, January, February, there just aren't military exercises held. So I think that not all quarters are going to have the same number of military exercises. So they're not apples to apples. But overall, I think this is a great start. This really helps the military exercise literature by looking into some of these motivations for why exercises are held and how they logistically come about.
This actually, can I? So something Kevin said, like, I think it's an interesting point about like, the sort of timing of this and thinking about like how long we would expect it to take before and like imagining that there's like let's say no status of force. So like I wonder, I mean, something you could very easily do is look at like the extensive margin outcome, right? Like are there any JMEs as opposed to just doing this sort of logged count thing? Because I mean that would deal with this recurring problem where like okay, you're gonna have no variation in that for these countries like Australia where there's always one. But then also it's like, I mean, I think that it would tell us a lot, right? Like it would be pretty impressive if you found an extensive margin effect. Like this is a country we don't typically have even one JME with, but now this experienced ambassador is leading us to have one or more. And so, yeah, I mean, you could run that regression today. Be cool.
Erik, some small, just more clarifying questions that are more for me because everyone else on this call knows a lot about these topics. What are sort of your theoretical thoughts or priors for like bilateral versus multilateral JMEs? Second, do we know some sense of the size or scale of these? I don't know if that's a sort of Kevin question for something that we might have measured in these beyond just number of countries. And third is I think that thinking about off-cycle JMEs is a really interesting sort of takeaway that I have from this call. We might know that JME happens with Australia every March. And so if something happens in an off, sort of an off election year cycle, that's sort of something that's interesting to maybe look at a little bit qualitatively. And one thing that you could maybe do is sort of one of the things I know most about JMEs is they're often like really awesome photo ops. So that's where, like, after the US does it with Japan, they get like, the sunset in the background, and there's the flying V of the aircraft carriers and things like that. And there's something that the states publicize about it. So they write like, a little piece of like, hey, we did this thing together. It looks super cool. Here's why we did it. I think sort of looking at how countries talk about these things could be sort of interesting or something something worth thinking about for getting at like, is this a crisis response thing? In which case we might think that the ambassador played one particular role, or is this our alliance with the US is very strong. We feel very confident about it, in which case reassurance might be the role. I think sort of looking at what do the countries say about these things could be interesting.
Yeah, so I guess for the first point about the kind of bilateral versus multilateral exercises, I guess my first thought is that like if the ambassador wants to kind of produce a new joint military exercise and involve a new host country, then a multilateral exercise might be a little bit easier, especially if it's kind of like bandwagoning on an existing bilateral exercise already. And so just expanding that out might be a little bit easier for the ambassador to do. I guess to some of the previous comments, in the past I've run some models kind of disaggregating between like recurring and non-recurring joint military exercises. I can't remember off the top of my head what those results looked like, but definitely something to revisit in the near future. So I think looking at those off-cycle, non-recurring JMEs would be pretty valuable in getting at this a little bit more precisely.
Yeah, a semi-related thought is that I wonder about NATO versus non-NATO, and how much that matters, right? So like that's a large share of our allies, a large share of our exercises taking place in a heavily institutionalized context that's, I think, going to be a lot less dependent on the bilateral relationship than sort of any other one. And then in line with that, I also think you might not want to use ATOP treaty alliances as your measure of alliances here, right? So like ATOP has the weirdness that via the Rio Pact, we are formal treaty allies with Venezuela and like just about every country in the Western Hemisphere. But we are not a formal treaty ally with like Israel. And so that has its own value, but I don't think treaty ally status is actually the relevant one for you. And so you might want to look at something like major non-NATO ally designation plus NATO, or just explore some other sort of more contextually appropriate measures of alliances.
Yeah, I use like the ATOP defensive alliances only. I don't know if that helps, but I definitely look into the kind of major non-NATO plus NATO only.
Great. So it looks like that's we're at about time for wrapping up there. So thank you, Erik, for presenting a great, interesting paper here. And thanks to Calvin, David, and Kevin for your all's feedback and suggestions. I learned a lot from this, and I feel like Erik, you did as well. So hopefully you have some good food for thought to sort of continue working on what's a really excellent and exciting project that I think folks are very interested in. For sorry. For those of you that are sort of watching this from home or that are otherwise in the audience and might have chimed in a little bit after the beginning, this will be posted on the Online Peace Science Colloquium YouTube page. So Erik, that might be helpful for you as well, given the extensive amount of thoughts that might have been happening faster than you can type. For anyone else that has any comments or questions for Erik, you can sort of contact Erik directly, or you could also comment on the YouTube page there to sort of get a running list of any discussion that happens afterwards. So thanks again to Erik and our discussants for this really great talk, the Online Peace Science Colloquium. We look forward to seeing you all at the next one.